everyone. Welcome to the Pediatrics Board Exam Strategy session. My name's Anne. I'm currently a Pediatric PICU Fellow in Chicago, and I've been with MST for almost 5 years, tutoring for the STEP exams and now for the Pediatric Board exams. And with me tonight is Annette. Annette, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Annette. I'm a second-year pediatric resident in Miami at Nicholas Children's Hospital. I'm aspiring to be a pediatric fellow in gastroenterology, so I'll be applying for fellowship this year. And I've been with MST since 2017. I've taught Step 1, I've taught Step 2, residency consulting, you name it. I've done a lot. So it's really nice to meet you guys today.
Awesome. So just while we're waiting for everyone to finish joining, I'm going to quickly just introduce you and tell you a little bit about MST. We're a team of both med students, residents, and attendings who have been tutoring students for over 15 years. And we have a ton of student success stories. Specifically, we're all groups that have done really well on our exams and love to teach. And we're really excited to help all of you as well if you guys decide that MST is a useful resource for you studying. So we're gonna use this as a way to help to show you how to study for your pediatric board exams. So some things that we're gonna cover today is we're gonna cover general kind of study timeline and tips. We're gonna talk about how to find study time during residency, which is definitely not always easy. We're gonna talk about how to use your ITE scores. We're going to talk about pediatric specific study resources for your boards. And then at the end, we'll have a live Q&A. While we're in this session, feel free to start typing your questions as they come to you. We'll answer the bulk of them at the end and really be kind of covering ones that are going to be broadly applicable. But if you guys have specific questions, we can definitely talk about those later one-on-one. So let's get started. So broadly about the study and timeline tips, really you should be starting to study from the first year of residency, and this should be something that you're doing from first year through third year. Specifically though, you need to adjust your expectations. This is not like Step 1 where you have months off to study. You likely aren't going to have that same amount of time for studying, and that's okay. And you need to give yourself a little bit of understanding that this is going to be hard to find the time to study. Because it is so hard to find the time, it's really important to start preparing for boards early, and you should not just be waiting until the last few months of residency or post-graduation. For example, we'll be talking about resources, but when you get a copy of P's and Review every month, you should be reading them as you get them rather than letting them pile up and try to accomplish them at the end. Specifically, you should limit your resources. If you end up trying to use too many resources, it's going to become really overwhelming and not possible to do. So resources that we'll talk about more at the end would be P's and Review, prep, and the MedStudy, specifically the Qbank, plus or minus the books and the flashcards. And really beyond that, you really should not need many resources. And then trying to find time on your lighter rotations to study. So things like electives, your outpatient blocks, your research blocks, and unfortunately, sometimes even vacation time to study, because when you're on something like PICU, it's going to be impossible to find time to study, and that's fine. Annette, do you want to talk a little bit about how you've been finding time to study during residency?
Sure. So in first year, of course, it's very, very difficult to find time. At least for our residency, we have 7 or 8 inpatient wards. But what I used to do with a couple of our friends, we would just do the Pedialink questions and at least like find some time, maybe once a week, to do just a couple questions just to stay brushed up with the information, and then also to pay attention during noon conferences. I know that can sometimes be hard in residency because you're 1 hour off, but I've noticed that when you pay attention, you kind of retain more and it helps you along the way. And then in second year, you kind of just add on. Second year, you have a little bit more time, so you could study a little bit more. Our program offers the MedStudy books. So a lot of us during second year will read the MedStudy books. We don't have access to the Qbank in second year, but we do have the MedStudy books and the flashcards. And then they do invite us to do board review with the third years if we're interested. And that's also available for first years. And then third year, you add on to that, do the questions, and go through all the resources like you said, and that you're going to mention.
Awesome. And obviously not every program is the same, but that's the general gist at my residency program. And I think at a lot of programs as well.
Absolutely.
So specifically, as Annette was talking about with like board review, these are usually going to be topic specific, seminars that are going to be based on these content outlines that you can see here. And this is from the ABP website. And it just shows you what percent of the questions are on a specific topic. So as you can see, the biggest topics are preventative pediatrics, well childcare. So things like immunizations and developmental milestones. And then other big topics are going to be the 5% ones. So NICU, adolescent care, infectious disease, mental and behavioral health. And so it's really helpful to kind of look at these content outlines so you can see which topics you really should be devoting the bulk of your attention to. Some of these are going to be much more like memorization, like developmental milestones. And then some of them are going to be more questions that are going to cause you to really have to think things through, do some equations, things like that, and are going to be more concepts that you need to learn and not necessarily just memorize. And so it's really helpful, as you know what you're weaker in, to look at this and see how important is that for pediatric boards. And then this other one, so those are the content areas. And then within those subgroups, the bulk of the questions are going to be on diagnoses and management and treatment, but there still is unfortunately some basic science and then some epidemiology. Annette, do you want to talk a little bit about some of your board review sessions?
Sure. And one thing I wanted to add before that is your ITE score can actually give you an idea of how you're doing. Because sometimes it's kind of hard to know exactly, like you might think you're really good at ID and then you take your ITE and realize that you got a significant amount of questions wrong. So when you do get your ITE scores, they do break it down for you in these exact like different content domains, and you can see how you're doing in each of them. So you can kind of cater your learning and stuff. And so our board review that we have, and usually they start it, at least in my program, they start it after January. And we go through each of these domains. So this week, actually, we had ours today because we have them on Thursday. We were doing ID. And so we started at preventative pediatrics, and we've been working our way each week, hitting each of the domains. And sometimes we'll do 2 in a row if, for example, it's a very heavy topic like ID.
Cool. And that is similar. Ours is actually year round and it's for second and third years. And so we would start in July and we do them every week actually, and just go through questions, primarily prep, but some other ones. So, and I'm sure that is something that is available at your programs as well and super helpful. Okay. Let's see. Okay, great. There we go. Okay. So study tips for Qbanks. There we go. The bulk of the Qbanks that is usually very helpful is MedStudy. And then Annette was mentioning Pedialink, which I think is helpful early on. But when we're talking about like the best premier Qbank that really is going to be important for test day, that's going to be MedStudy. There are a couple big ways that you can approach the question. So one way that you can do it is you can do questions that are particular to the patient cases that you're seeing on the wards. And this is helpful if you have a particular MedStudy package that actually allows you to do questions by topic. So then you could do, say you're taking care of a child with congenital heart disease. You could do congenital heart disease, specifically only those questions, and not even have to filter them through like only doing cardiology questions. So that's one way that you can approach it. And then the other one is that you can approach it from I'm on the cardiology rotation, I'm going to get through my cardiology questions. And I think either of those works. And I think is a helpful way to approach MedStudy while you're still in residency. Afterwards, it's going to be really helpful to do MedStudy as you're doing them randomly after you finish residency. But while you're in residency, it's definitely helpful to be doing them on the topics that you're seeing because it just helps it to stick a little bit more. One thing that should be noted here is that if you have failed any of the USMLE exams before, you really should have a longitudinal plan and really should be starting to do questions as soon as first year and not just wait until second or third year. Annette, any question, like anything you want to add about the Qbanks?
Yeah, the one thing I would add would be the grouping of the questions, just to reiterate that. I think it's really good. At least a lot of the residents at my program, especially in second year, we like to do it based on our rotations because we do a lot more elective type rotations. So for example, doing the cardio questions on the cardio, like on your cardio block. So since we don't have our MedStudy Qbank until third year, we do the flashcards. So I have my like handy dandy flashcards. So what the residents will do is it's adolescent medicine block, and we'll take the adolescent medicine cards and we'll do that together. And then we'll do the Pedialink questions that are adolescent specific, just because we don't have MedStudy as a second year. And so it depends on your program. If you have MedStudy, the Qbank, start early, of course.
No, I think that's really good. And then it looks like we have a question in the chat about how to take notes on the Qbanks. I had found that it was mostly helpful to keep track of it on the ones that I was getting wrong. And either like if you get the MedStudy flashcards, I think that's really helpful. And then you don't really need to be taking notes on everything. And then just the way that you have usually studied for your USMLE exams is probably how I would approach the PEDS boards too, for the ones that you're getting wrong. I'm personally make a large Word document that's separated by subject that I tried to keep organized so that I could study that at the end. But if you are more of I take notes in creating my own flashcards so that I can review that, I think that's also a really helpful way to take notes on Qbanks. But I think primarily focusing on the ones that you get wrong, I don't think that you need to necessarily be taking extensive notes on the ones that you're getting right. And anything you would add on that question?
I agree with you totally. One thing I like to do is Anki cards, but that's just because that's how I always did it for step 1 and step 2 and step 3. So for me, it helps to do a quick little Anki card on like the questions I get wrong and to review it later. But like you said, it's not necessary, especially if you really like the MedStudy flashcards, since they basically have all that information.
Exactly. Cool. Okay. We've talked about Qbanks. We've talked about the general timeline. So the next thing that we were going to talk about is the in-training exam scores. And these really should be kind of a guide for how to approach your studying. And not necessarily for first year do you need to study. I think it's really important for first year to kind of just see, like, you're learning the medicine, you're going to see kind of what your red flag areas are. In the second year, you should be studying and you should address any gaps in knowledge that you're going to see on this. As Annette had said earlier, they break it down by the content outline. And so they'll show you, this is a topic that's you're particularly weak in, this is one that you're particularly strong in. And so they will you can then focus your energy on those ones that you have gaps in. And then in third year, based on what score you have, you really should be able to make a study plan going forward in the year. As you guys probably know, your in-training exams happen in July. And so you have a full year and more, because the board exam is in October, to really make this study plan. And that's how it's really most helpful to approach this. Annette, do you want to talk about your experiences with the in-training?
Yes, I actually have my report here, and I have it here as a reference just because I think the report really does tell you a lot and gives you an idea exactly where you are. It also shows you like a little bell curve type thing where you can compare yourself, your score based in comparison to what is considered a passing score for the boards and where the national average is for your year. So those are really awesome to use. And then so first year, I would say for ITE, no one really studies for it because you just finished medical school. And you're starting residency in June, and then all of a sudden it's ITE. So it's kind of overwhelming, and that's fine. Obviously you don't want to study like for that, but then each year I always say, prepare for the ITEs, because if you actually study at least like a week or two, maybe a little more, if you can, then it's even more of an accurate representation of how you're going to do, in my opinion. So if possible, depending on when you're taking or like what your schedule is like, I actually do recommend taking step 3 around the time that you're taking your second year ITE board. I mean, I guess it depends on the program because some programs force you to take it by December of your first year. But if you do have more flexibility, I found that to be really helpful to take the step 3 around the time you take your second year ITE, because then you have a pretty good idea of where you're at. So the ITE boards are very useful in terms of your progression. And just like I said, make sure you like try your best to study for them.
Yeah. And it looks like we have a question on if the IT questions are similar to step 3. So the PEDS questions could be similar, but your step 3, right, is going to be all topics in medicine, right? It's going to be medicine, PEDS, surgery. And so it is going to be much broader than just the pediatric ITE questions that you see. So warning signs to heed here. So specifically, if you have previously struggled with standardized tests in the past, that it's really important to know that. And this is another standardized test. This probably will be just as challenging. Specifically on your in-training exam, if you're in the 25th to 30th percentile, or if any of your scores are less than 180, that would be a warning sign because above 180 is required for passing. If as a PGY2, you're having lots of concepts that you really are not familiar with in conference, despite the fact that you have heard it a little bit before and like seen it on the wards, that should make you a little bit nervous. And then any red flags during your yearly evaluations with program directors, if people are telling you that they're having some concerns about your ability to pass the board exam, that should definitely give you pause. And anything else you would add?
Yeah, the only thing I would add is that program directors take the ITE exams and their passing rate for the boards very seriously. So if they're concerned about your progress and how you're doing, they will tell you. And they will also give you positive feedback if you're doing well on them. So whatever your program director is telling you, they're being honest with you and you should listen to what they're saying.
So common mistakes to avoid, and definitely some that I've seen amongst my classmates. So waiting until PGY3 to start studying or post-residency to start studying, you absolutely don't want to do this. And we've kind of already outlined how to make it happen so that you start in first year. Don't take on too much too fast. So taking on too many resources in the beginning, is going to actually end up causing problems later. So trying to limit those major resources and finding time when you can do it. You have to pace yourself. And then really importantly is to not be too hard on yourself, because it is really hard to study for this exam during residency. You have a full-time job, more than a full-time job, because you're working 80 hours a week sometimes. And now we're telling you that you need to start studying for this exam, starting as a first year, and something else to just add on to your plate. And so some days on those easier rotations, it's going to be easier to find time to study. And there's going to be some days when you're on the PICU that you're absolutely not going to have any time to study. And that is totally fine. And you can't be too hard on yourself. But it is important to kind of make the schedule early so that you have kind of that wiggle room and being honest with yourself on, can I study now? This is a really hard rotation. I'm probably not going to be able to study during this rotation, but when I'm on behavior and development, I will be able to, and I'm going to schedule more of my studying then. So pacing yourself and then just giving yourself a little bit of forgiveness, because this is not easy what you're doing. Nat, anything else you would add?
And I would just add to the second point, don't take on too much too fast. That includes extracurriculars too, because I know a lot of residents, especially when you're done with your second year, your first year, and you're going into second year, you are now in like fellowship mind, especially if you are applying for fellowship. So you're looking for case reports, you're looking for research, you're looking for other extracurriculars, and you're trying to study for boards. So just to reiterate, number 2, the second and fourth point, don't be too hard on yourself, but also it's okay to say no to case reports. It's okay to say no to research projects. Prioritize things, and studying and doing questions should be one of your priorities.
Okay. So planning for your final year of residency, and this really You should absolutely have a plan by January at the latest. But like we talked about, your IT comes out in July. And so starting one in July is not the worst thing either. So knowledge is power. You really want to see where your baseline starting point is. And really the IT can be a really helpful place to kind of show you where you're starting, right? We talked about those warning scores of being less than 180 or less than the 25th percentile. And so knowing that is really important. Make a calendar. Kind of like step one, right? You had this really intense calendar where you said, this is what I'm going to do at this point. And like we said, making it a realistic calendar, but making a calendar to hold yourself accountable. I kind of just combine those two bullet points right there, but being realistic on when you will have time to study and when you won't. You should set aside some time to select and purchase your study resources. We'll tell you the ones that we've used and found helpful, but you should also do your own research and talk to kind of your co-residents, your recently graduated, now attendings, see what they used for their resources and how they felt the exam was and how prepared they felt. And that can be really helpful for choosing what resources you want to use. And so we've kind of been saying this as we've gone along, but I think just helpful to have it all in one slide. So in first and second year, the big resources that I recommend to my students are the Pediatrics in Review, which you guys get mailed by being members of the AAP. What is really important about this, I know a lot of people are like, this is a magazine, I'm going to throw it away, is that actually in the 3 years that you are a resident, those are the topics that are on your board exam. That's where they say they take these questions from. And so essentially they will cover every topic that's important in those 3 years. They have questions in there and they're really pretty easy to read and pretty comprehensive. So this was something that I would get a copy of in the mail. I would read it that month so that I wouldn't let them pile up and get behind. While doing that, the other thing that I would use is prep questions. And why I use the prep questions is these questions are great. They're made by the AAP. They have super long explanations, but the question stems are also pretty long and also pretty challenging. And so they're not like the board exam. They're much harder than the board exam. And so this is not really a resource that's helpful to use in the last push when you're studying. It's much more helpful to use it as you're going along. And I would add in Pedialink, like Annette has said, that's a good one to use for your first and second year resources. Third year is where I really start recommending MedStudy. The question bank is super helpful. And then the books and flashcards, I think one depends on what they give you in your program. So if you're as lucky as Annette and you get the books and the flashcards, I would absolutely use them. If you're not as lucky as Annette and you're like me and we had to pay for all of our resources, I think you have to kind of assess with yourself, are you a book person? Are you a flashcard person? Or are you just a Qbank person? And you should know that now from kind of studying for step one, if you really like and need books, if you really like and need flashcards. So that's why I put a plus minus there, because I don't think that they are necessary for every single person taking the board exam. I think the question bank is absolutely necessary for everybody taking the pediatric board exam. And then you have to kind of be honest with yourself on if you need those other resources. And then post-residency, you should definitely be doing the MedStudy question bank. If you chose to get the flashcards, I would continue using them post-residency. The books really should only be used during third year. They're really dense. They have a ton of material in them, which makes them great, but they're way too dense to be using in your last push. And then one resource that a lot of people don't know about is the ABP practice test. And this is something that you can find on your portal once you've applied to take the board exam. That is 100 questions written by the pediatric board. And so these are the only questions that are actually written by the people who will be writing your board exam. And so these are the questions that are most like your actual board exam. And so something that you absolutely should be doing, but a lot of people don't know about. It's 100 questions. You can find it on the portal. And that is my main kind of discussion on resources. Annette, if you want to talk about any of your personal experience with using them, that would be great.
So I kind of highlighted a lot of it already. So like I was saying, I have the books and then I have the flashcards, which is what I've been doing this year. I can't wait for the Qbank because like you've said, if you're a Qbank, a book, a flashcard kind of person, I'm definitely a Qbank person. So for me, the Pedialink was great. And I'm really looking forward to getting the MedStudy flashcards. One thing that I noticed somebody asked, what about Nelson's? I have Nelson's, but this is one of 2 books. So, I mean, if you think about it, what are the chances that you're going to be able to read this? So I don't recommend, and you can, put your opinion, like say your opinion as well. But I feel like Nelson is great if you just need a little brush up on a specific topic and you want to read about a specific topic, you could look it up in Nelson's. But as like a textbook to read and study, I wouldn't recommend it.
I totally agree. And this might be awful to say, but I don't even have a copy of Nelson's. I've never had a copy of Nelson's. That probably means I'm not even really a pediatrician. I do not, I think it is way too dense and thorough to actually be something that is useful. I think it's a good reference and probably something that every pediatrician should have. Again, probably means I'm not really a pediatrician, but I don't think useful for approaching the board exam. Just a quick page about what the board exam actually is. This is a prometric exam, just kind of like your step exams. The important thing to note here is that there's actually a pretty lengthy application process to get to be board eligible. And so something you want to start on the earlier side, and also make sure that you're doing on time, because if you do not apply early enough, you actually have to pay more money and it's already a really expensive test. So make sure that you are on top of that and applying. It's a 7-hour long test, so it's pretty darn long. You do have 90 minutes of break time on top of that. So if you take all the breaks and all the time for all the different, like the survey and the intro, it will be 9 hours long. So it's a pretty long test. It's 330 to 350 questions. That is because not every test is actually the same, and it's divided into 4 sections. So if you do the math with how long the test is, it's about 75 seconds per question. The questions are a little bit shorter than step questions. If you guys have started doing MedStudy, the questions are not particularly long, so they are pretty quick to read through and to answer. But just to keep it in mind that really you don't have a ton of time to answer them. And then, like we talked about, the questions cover that pediatrics and review topics over the last 3 years, and specifically over that content outline that we went over on the first slide. So just to summarize, and before we hit the Q&A part, just to put in a quick plug again about MST, we've kind of gone over a lot of general things, but we're here if you guys decide that one-on-one tutoring would be helpful. Things that we'll do is that we'll help you to make that custom study schedule so that we make sure that you're staying on track. And that can be starting in first year, that could be starting in third year, that could be starting after you graduate from residency. We have a lot of communication between sessions. We have lots of resources that we will give you. And then we're also really helpful to kind of make sure that you're staying on track, to be a mentor and a support during this really stressful time. We also do some tutoring for in-training exams. And then if like full tutoring is not something that you would find helpful, but you just want a one-time strategic planning session, that is also available. So we will move on into the Q&A part. Please let us know if you guys have any specific questions. It looks like somebody asked about the Nelson's board review. I personally have not looked or used it. Really, the resources that I talked about were the ones that I used and pretty much everyone in my residency used. So I really don't have any like experience or thoughts on it because I haven't used it versus all the other ones I can vouch for.
And I would agree with that. I actually didn't even know that Nelson's had a boards review. Yeah. So I also have nothing to add to that.
So when that happens, I would say I probably would not move towards it unless you've heard from kind of your co-residents, recent grads, that they have found it particularly useful. If that's true, then I think that's awesome. But otherwise, I probably wouldn't.
Right. I think the big thing is, like you said before, limiting your resources, because there's so many resources out there. But I feel like to do the best that you can, you maximize like less resources.
Absolutely.
And I think that's the same for when you study for step 1 and step 2 and step 3. I think the same thing goes for those exams as it does for the pediatric board exam. And there's a question, are there any other areas where you think someone could go wrong in their studies? So I would say really the time management, I think, is the number one in residency where you can go wrong. And also just not taking it seriously in residency. I know in third year, I mean, especially if you have board review early on, it's hard to pay attention because you're thinking, oh, my boards aren't for a whole nother year, or even second, first year. I don't have boards for over a year. Like I don't have to worry about this, but the key is to start early and do a little bit, like when you can, versus try to cram it all in at the end.
The other thing that I think is important that we didn't really talk about is what your post-residency plans are, because that really is going to change how you're able to study post-residency. So we're really focused on your study schedule during residency, because that is one thing that's pretty much the same for everyone. But if you're going to do something like PICU fellowship, it's a little bit different than if you're going to go and do outpatient pediatrics, where some practices will give you time off. I know friends that did hospitalist medicine that were given weeks off before the exam. I was working up until the weekend before my test. So it totally just depends. And you need to know what your plans are post residency so that your schedule really incorporates that. So that's one thing that we didn't talk about that I think is somewhere where you can go wrong, is if you don't really know how demanding your requirements are going to be post residency and you don't account for that.
That's a really interesting point. Could you talk a little bit more about your experience being in PICU and taking the boards?
Yeah, sure can. So we have some easier weeks, so essentially like how I gave the feedback of making sure to study when you are on easier rotations. That was what I had to do, because we have like a couple anesthesia weeks. We have a transport week and we have a few research weeks. And I will say that my research weeks early on were really not focused on research and mostly focused on studying for the boards. And so just like during residency, it was about kind of trying to find time to do that. Most residencies will give you, our fellowships will give you easy weeks leading up into the exam, but it's still not completely time off. Like I was on anesthesia the week of my boards. And so like I technically wasn't even, they gave me the day off, but I worked the day before, I worked the day after my board exam. And it's like 7 to 2. And so I had hours in the afternoon, but it's just really important to know that, because it was exhausting the first few months, because I was coming home and I thought residency was hard. Fellowship is even harder depending on what you do. And then I wasn't even just coming home and being able to watch TV. I was coming home and having to study and do questions. And so I think it can be helpful to start that in residency, because if you think you're tired in residency, it doesn't always get easier. Sometimes it does. It doesn't always. And so I think practicing and having those good habits already in place made it really easy to make the transition into fellowship.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions people have right now?
So looks like that's about it.
Yeah. Well, awesome. Well, this was really awesome. I hope that you guys learned some things that were helpful here. As always, if you have more questions, we at MST are here to help, and we are here to help you through this process, which we've talked about. It's not always easy, but happy to help with your journey.
Thank you. Bye, everyone. Have a great rest of your evening.
Bye, everybody.